The rain had been falling steadily all morning, turning the courthouse parking lot into a maze of puddles and wet concrete. Officer David Harrison stood in the main hallway, his uniform crisp and his badge polished to perfection. He'd been a police officer for almost 16 years now, and if there was one thing he knew, it was how to carry himself with authority. Today was Thursday, which meant traffic court. David had 3 cases on the docket, all routine stuff. A speeding ticket here, a broken taillight there. Nothing that would take more than an hour of his time. He leaned against the wall near courtroom 3B, flipping through his notebook and reviewing the details of each case. His partner, Officer Tom Bradley, stood beside him, sipping coffee from a paper cup. "Should be a quick morning," Tom said, glancing at his watch. "Judge Morrison always moves things along." David nodded. "Yeah, I've got that lunch meeting at noon with the new recruits." "Shouldn't be a problem." The courthouse was already filling up with people. Lawyers in expensive suits hurried past, their leather shoes clicking against the marble floor. Court clerks pushed carts loaded with file boxes. A few anxious-looking defendants sat on the wooden benches lining the walls, whispering nervously to their family members. David had seen it all before. After 16 years, courtrooms felt like a second home to him. He knew which judges were strict and which ones were lenient. He knew which lawyers tried to play games and which ones were straightforward. He had the system figured out, or so he thought. That's when he noticed her. A woman in her late 30s was walking down the hallway, heading toward courtroom 3B. She wore a dark blue blazer that looked a bit wrinkled, and her hair was slightly damp from the rain. She carried an old leather briefcase that had seen better days, the kind with scuff marks and worn corners. Her shoes were practical flats, nothing fancy. David's eyes swept over her with the quick assessment he'd developed over years of police work. She didn't look like a lawyer. Lawyers dressed sharper, even the public defenders. She didn't quite look like a defendant either, but maybe a witness or someone here to support a family member. The woman walked closer, and David noticed she seemed a bit flustered, like she'd been rushing. There was a coffee stain on the sleeve of her blazer that she probably hadn't even noticed yet. "Excuse me," she said politely as she approached the courtroom entrance. David barely looked up from his notebook. Without much thought, he gestured toward the left side of the courtroom with his pen. "Public seating is on the left. Make sure your cell phone is completely off, not just on silent. Judge Morrison doesn't tolerate any disruptions." The woman stopped and looked at him directly. Her eyes were calm and thoughtful, not defensive or annoyed. "Thank you, officer," she said simply. There was something in her voice, a quiet dignity that David didn't quite register in the moment. She stood there for just a second longer, as if waiting to see if he would say anything else or perhaps realize his mistake. But David had already turned back to Tom, dismissing her from his attention entirely. "I swear," David said to his partner, his voice just loud enough that a few people nearby could hear, including the woman. "Some people really don't make any effort to dress appropriately for court. It's like they don't understand this is a place of law. Shows a real lack of respect for the system, you know?" Tom glanced at the woman who was now walking away, and something flickered across his face. Discomfort, maybe, but he didn't say anything, just took another sip of his coffee. The woman didn't respond to David's comment. She didn't turn around or give him a sharp look. She simply continued walking with her briefcase, moving past the public entrance and toward a side door that David knew led to the judge's chambers and other restricted areas. The door had a sign that clearly read, "Authorized personnel only." David watched her go through that door with a slight frown. Must be a clerk or something," he muttered. "Though you'd think they'd dress a bit more professionally." "Maybe she had a rough morning," Tom offered quietly. "We all have rough mornings," David replied. "That's no excuse. You wear the uniform right, you show up right. That's what separates professionals from everyone else." Tom didn't argue, but he looked like he wanted to say something. Instead, he just checked his watch again. "We should probably head in. Court starts in 15 minutes. David nodded and straightened his uniform, making sure everything was perfect. His shirt was pressed, his tie was straight, and his shoes were shined. Appearance mattered. Respect mattered. At least that's what he'd always believed. They weren't the only officers in the hallway. 2 more cops were waiting for their own cases, and they exchanged nods with David and Tom. Everyone knew each other around here. The courthouse was a regular stop for officers who had to testify about arrests, traffic stops, and incidents they'd witnessed on duty. A young couple sat on one of the benches nearby, holding hands and talking in hushed voices. The woman looked worried and the man kept reassuring her about something. David figured they were here for a minor violation, probably their first time in court. He'd seen that nervous energy 1,000 times. An older gentleman in a janitor's uniform pushed a cleaning cart past them, stopping to empty a trash can. He nodded at David with the kind of respect that uniformed officers often received. David nodded back. It was these small acknowledgments that reminded him of why he'd chosen this career. The badge meant something. It represented order and authority. Inside his notebook, David reviewed his first case one more time. A man named Richard Palmer had been clocked going 52 miles per hour in a 35 zone, school zone 2, which made it worse. The guy had given some excuse about a family emergency, but David had heard every excuse in the book. Family emergency, medical emergency, late for work, didn't see the sign. None of it changed the fact that rules existed for a reason. "You ready?" Tom asked, draining the last of his coffee and tossing the cup into a nearby recycling bin. "Born ready," David replied with a confident smile. They pushed open the heavy wooden doors to courtroom 3B and stepped inside. The room had that distinct smell of old wood and floor polish. The walls were paneled in dark oak, and the windows were tall but covered with heavy curtains that kept most of the natural light out. Overhead, fluorescent lights hummed softly, casting everything in a slightly harsh glow. The courtroom was already half full. Defense attorneys shuffled papers at their tables. A few defendants sat in the gallery, waiting for their names to be called. The court reporter was setting up her equipment at her small desk beside the judge's bench. David and Tom took their seats in the section reserved for law enforcement, right behind the prosecutor's table. David set his notebook down and felt that familiar sense of routine settling over him. This was just another day, just another court session. He had no idea that in less than 20 minutes, everything he thought he understood about respect, authority, and judgment was about to be turned completely upside down. The bailiff entered from a side door and began checking his paperwork. The prosecutor arrived and started organizing files. The clock on the wall ticked toward 9 o'clock. Any minute now, Judge Morrison would emerge from his chambers, and the day's proceedings would begin. But Judge Morrison wasn't coming, and the woman David had dismissed in the hallway was about to change his perspective forever. David sat in the courtroom, tapping his pen against his notebook. 9 o'clock came and went, then 9:05. The courtroom was full now, with people shifting in their seats and checking their phones. Defense attorneys whispered to each other, wondering what was causing the delay. Judge Morrison was usually punctual, arriving right at 9 to start the session. Tom leaned over and whispered, "This isn't like Morrison." "Wonder if something's wrong," David shrugged. "Traffic, maybe. Or he's stuck on a phone call." Another 5 minutes passed. The murmuring in the courtroom grew louder. A few people started checking the hallway, wondering if they were in the right place. The bailiff disappeared into the back chambers, presumably to find out what was going on. David glanced around the courtroom, taking in the familiar scene. The American flag stood in the corner, flanked by the state flag. The seal of the court hung behind the judge's bench, polished and official. Everything was ready. They were just waiting for the judge. Finally, at 9:15, the bailiff emerged from the judge's chambers. He was a stocky man in his 50s named Robert, someone David had known for years. Robert walked to his position near the bench and cleared his throat loudly to get everyone's attention. "All rise," Robert announced in his booming voice. The sound of chairs scraping and bodies standing filled the courtroom. David stood up automatically, smoothing his uniform. This was it. Court was finally about to begin. He expected to see Judge Morrison walk through the door in his black robes, probably apologizing for the delay. But Judge Morrison didn't appear. Instead, the door to the judge's chambers opened, and the woman from the hallway stepped out. David's breath caught in his throat. She was wearing the same wrinkled blue blazer he'd seen earlier, the same practical flats. But now over her clothes she wore the unmistakable black robes of a judge. Her hair was still slightly damp from the rain, and if you looked closely you could still see that coffee stain on her sleeve peeking out from under the robe. She walked to the bench W, with calm, measured steps, carrying herself with quiet authority. The old leather briefcase was now sitting on the desk in the judge's chambers out of sight. She climbed the steps to the elevated bench and stood there for a moment, looking out over the courtroom. David felt his face grow hot. His stomach dropped. Tom shot him a quick sideways glance that clearly said, "Oh no." The woman settled into the judge's chair and looked directly at everyone assembled. Her expression was professional and composed, showing no trace of the dismissive treatment she'd received just 30 minutes earlier. "Please be seated," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. Everyone sat down, but David could barely move. He lowered himself into his chair mechanically, his mind racing. This couldn't be happening. The woman he'd brushed off, the woman whose appearance he'd criticized within earshot, was a judge. Not just any court employee, but a judge. "Good morning, everyone," she continued. "I apologize for the delayed start and for any confusion. I am Judge Rebecca Chen. Judge Morrison had a family emergency early this morning and had to leave town unexpectedly. His mother was taken to the hospital in the next county. I was asked to step in and handle today's docket on short notice." Judge Chen paused and gestured to her casual attire beneath the robe. "I also apologize for my appearance. I came directly from a meeting at the Children's Advocacy Center across town and didn't have time to go home and change before coming here. I hope you'll forgive the informality." Several people in the courtroom nodded understandingly. A few attorneys smiled sympathetically. One older woman in the gallery even said, "It's fine, Your Honor," loud enough for everyone to hear. But David wasn't smiling. He was dying inside. Judge Chen's eyes swept across the courtroom, taking in the prosecutors, the defense attorneys, the defendants waiting nervously, and finally, the law enforcement section where David sat. Her gaze landed on him for just a fraction of a second longer than everyone else. Not in an angry way or an accusatory way, just a simple acknowledgement that she remembered him. Then she looked away and opened the first file on her desk. "Let's proceed with this morning's cases," she said. "We have quite a full docket, so I appreciate everyone's patience and cooperation." Tom leaned toward David and whispered so quietly that only David could hear, "Dude, you okay?" David couldn't respond. He just sat there staring at the bench, feeling like the world's biggest fool. Every word he'd said in that hallway echoed in his head. Every dismissive gesture, every assumption he'd made. She'd heard it all. She'd been standing right there when he told Tom that some people don't respect the system enough to dress appropriately, and she'd said nothing. She just thanked him politely and walked away. The bailiff called the first case, and a young man in jeans and a button-down shirt approached the bench with his public defender. David tried to focus on what was happening, but his mind kept replaying the hallway encounter, the coffee stain he'd noticed, the worn briefcase he'd judged, the way he'd pointed toward public seating without even really looking at her. Judge Chen was speaking to the young man now, reviewing the charges. Driving with a suspended license. The young man explained that he hadn't known his license was suspended due to unpaid parking tickets. He'd thought he had more time to pay them. David watched how she handled it. She was firm but not harsh. She asked questions about his situation, about whether he had a job, about whether he could afford to pay the fines. When she learned he'd already paid the tickets and reinstated his license, she reduced the charge and the fine, but made it clear that ignorance of the law wasn't an excuse. "You have a responsibility to keep track of these things, Mr. Peterson," she said, "but I can see you've taken steps to correct the situation. I'm going to give you a payment plan for this fine. Don't make me regret giving you a break." The young man thanked her repeatedly and left the courtroom looking relieved. David had to admit, even in his state of mortification, that she was good. She had a way of being authoritative without being cruel, of upholding the law while still seeing the humanity in the people before her. Case after case proceeded. A woman who'd been caught texting while driving broke down in tears, explaining that she'd been distracted by a message from her daughter's school. Judge Chen listened carefully, reviewed the woman's clean driving record, and gave her the option to attend a defensive driving course to reduce the fine. An older man contested a red light camera ticket, arguing that the light had malfunctioned. Judge Chen examined the photographic evidence, asked detailed questions, and ultimately dismissed the ticket when she found inconsistencies in the timestamp. Throughout it all, David sat in his seat watching and waiting. He knew his cases were coming up. He'd have to stand before her, give his testimony, and look her in the eye. The thought made his palms sweat. Tom kept glancing at him, concern evident on his face. Other officers in the room occasionally looked his way too. The whispered comment in the hallway hadn't just been overheard by the judge. Other people had been there too. By now, word had probably spread through the courthouse about what had happened. David felt like he was shrinking in his seat. He'd spent 16 years building a reputation as a solid, reliable officer. He'd trained younger cops, mentored rookies, and prided himself on his professionalism. And in one careless moment, he'd revealed the ugly side of that professional polish. The quick judgments, the surface-level assessments, the assumption that appearance told you everything you needed to know about a person. Judge Chen called a brief recess after the 5th case. People stood and stretched, grateful for the break. Some headed to the hallway for water or to make phone calls. Defense attorneys clustered together, discussing their cases. David stayed in his seat. He couldn't bear to go into that hallway where he'd made such a fool of himself. Tom stood up and gestured toward the door. "Come on, let's grab some air." "I'm good here," David said quietly. "David, man, you're going to have to testify in like 20 minutes. You need to get your head right, I know. Look, you messed up. She heard you say something stupid. But she's not going to hold it against you in court. She's a professional." David nodded, but he wasn't sure he believed it. Not because he thought Judge Chen would be unfair, but because he wasn't sure he could forgive himself. For 16 years, he'd worn his badge with pride. He'd believed he was one of the good ones, someone who served and protected everyone equally. But in that hallway, he'd proven otherwise. He'd judged someone based on appearances. He'd assumed and dismissed and criticized. And the person he'd done it to now sat at the bench, literally holding the power of the court in her hands. The bailiff called everyone back into the courtroom. The break was over. Judge Chen returned to the bench carrying a fresh stack of files. She looked just as composed as before, showing no signs of fatigue despite the morning's pace. "Let's continue," she said, opening the next file. David's heart pounded. His case had to be coming up soon. There were only a few more before they reached his name on the docket. He gripped his notebook tighter, trying to prepare himself mentally for what was about to happen. And then he heard it. Case number 2847, the bailiff announced. The State versus Richard Palmer. Officer David Harrison testifying. This was it. David stood up, his legs feeling unsteady. He walked toward the witness stand, very aware of Judge Chen's eyes following his movement. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down in the witness chair. From this angle, Judge Chen was even more imposing. The elevated bench put her above everyone else in the room, a physical reminder of the authority she held. She looked down at the file in front of her, then up at David. Their eyes met for the first time since the hallway, and David realized that what happened next would reveal not just what kind of judge she was, but what kind of man he truly wanted to be. David's throat felt dry as he sat in the witness chair. Judge Chen looked down at the file before her, her reading glasses perched on her nose. She took her time reviewing the documents, and every second of silence felt like an eternity to David. Finally, she looked up. Her expression was neutral, professional. If she held any resentment about what had happened in the hallway, she didn't show it. "Officer Harrison," she began, her voice clear and measured. "Please state your testimony regarding the citation issued to Mr. Richard Palmer on the morning of September 28th. David cleared his throat and opened his notebook, though his hands were trembling slightly. He'd testified in court hundreds of times before. This should have been routine, but nothing about this moment felt routine. "Yes, Your Honor," he began. "On September 28th at approximately 7:45 in the morning, I was conducting speed enforcement on Maple Avenue near Roosevelt Elementary School. The school zone speed limit is 35 miles per hour during school hours. I observed a blue Honda Accord traveling at what appeared to be excessive speed." He paused to swallow, his mouth still dry. Judge Chen nodded for him to continue. "I used my radar gun and clocked the vehicle at 52 miles per hour. That's 17 miles over the posted limit. I initiated a traffic stop approximately 2 blocks past the school. The driver was cooperative and provided his license and registration immediately." "And that driver was Mr. Palmer?" Judge Chen asked, glancing toward the defendant's table where a man in his early 30s sat nervously beside his public defender. "Yes, Your Honor, Mr. Richard Palmer." "Did Mr. Palmer provide any explanation for his speed?" David hesitated. This was the part that had been bothering him since he'd issued the ticket. "Yes, Your Honor. He stated that his wife was in labor and he was driving her to Memorial Hospital." He showed me his phone with several text messages from his wife. She was at their home, and according to the messages, her contractions were about 4 minutes apart. A few people in the courtroom shifted in their seats. Judge Chen's expression didn't change, but she leaned forward slightly. And what was your response to this explanation, Officer Harrison? David felt heat rising up his neck. I told him that I understood the situation was stressful, but that speeding in a school zone was dangerous regardless of the circumstances. I explained that there were children present and that an accident could have had serious consequences. I issued the citation and advised him to drive more carefully to the hospital. Did you offer to provide any assistance? An escort, perhaps? David's jaw tightened. No, Your Honor, I did not. Judge Chen made a note on her paper. Then she looked at the defendant. Mr. Palmer, please approach the bench. Richard Palmer stood up, his public defender beside him. He looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes. He wore a simple shirt and khakis, and he gripped a folder of documents tightly in his hand. Mr. Palmer, Judge Chen said, her voice softening just slightly, I see this is your first traffic violation in 10 years of driving. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, Richard replied, his voice shaky. I've never even had a parking ticket before this. And I understand from your attorney that your wife did indeed give birth that morning? Richard's face brightened for just a moment despite his nervousness. Yes, Your Honor, our son Daniel. He was born at 8:27 that morning, about 40 minutes after Officer Harrison pulled me over. He weighed 7 pounds, 3 ounces. He opened the folder and pulled out a birth certificate and a hospital photo. I brought proof if you need to see it. Judge Chen accepted the documents and examined them carefully. A baby wrapped in a blue blanket, his tiny face scrunched up, his parents beaming beside him despite clearly being exhausted. She studied the birth certificate, noting the date and time. Congratulations on your son, Mr. Palmer, she said, and there was genuine warmth in her voice now. I'm sure that was a frightening morning for you and your wife. Thank you, Your Honor. It was our first child and everything happened so fast. We'd thought we had more time, but then her water broke and the contractions started coming really close together. I panicked. I know I was speeding and I know it was wrong, especially near a school. But I was terrified we wouldn't make it to the hospital in time. Judge Chen nodded slowly, then turned her attention back to David. Officer Harrison, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. In your 16 years of law enforcement, have you ever had to make a quick decision in an emergency situation, a moment where you had to weigh the rules against extraordinary circumstances? David knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't just asking about this case. She was asking him to think about judgment itself, about the difference between enforcing rules and understanding context. Yes, Your Honor, he admitted, many times. And in those moments, did you always follow the letter of the law? Or did you sometimes use discretion? David was quiet for a moment. He thought about the times he'd let someone off with a warning instead of a ticket. The times he'd bent the rules slightly because the situation called for it. The grandmother he'd driven home instead of citing for an expired registration because she'd been on her way to see her dying husband in hospice. The teenager he'd scared straight with a stern talking to instead of arresting for possession of marijuana. I've used discretion, Your Honor, he said quietly. So you understand that law enforcement isn't just about rigid application of rules. It's about wisdom, about seeing the full picture of a situation and responding appropriately. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Chen removed her reading glasses and set them on the bench. She looked at David. And this time there was something in her eyes that went beyond this case. It was the same look she'd given him in the hallway when he'd dismissed her. Not anger, but something deeper. Disappointment, maybe. Or perhaps just an invitation to be better. Officer Harrison, your commitment to school zone safety is commendable. Children's safety is paramount. And officers like you who take that seriously make our community safer. I want to be clear about that. David nodded, feeling a slight relief, but he knew there was more coming. However, Judge Chen continued, justice requires us to look at context. Mr. Palmer wasn't speeding because he was reckless or careless. He wasn't racing for fun or because he was late to work. He was facing a genuine emergency. His wife was in active labor at home alone, and he was trying to get to her as quickly as possible to take her to the hospital. She picked up another document from the file. I also have a statement here from the principal of Roosevelt Elementary, stating that school didn't begin until 8:15 that morning. and that at 7:45, when this stop occurred, there were no children present on the street or sidewalks. The crossing guards hadn't even arrived yet. David felt his stomach sink. He hadn't checked on that detail. He'd assumed that because it was a school zone during school hours, children must be present. Mr. Palmer slowed down immediately when you signaled him. Judge Chen continued. He pulled over safely. He was cooperative and respectful. He showed you evidence of his emergency, and despite all of that, you chose to issue a citation rather than exercise the discretion that your position allows for exactly these kinds of situations. The courtroom was silent. Everyone was watching. David could feel Tom's eyes on him from the gallery. He could feel the weight of every person in that room waiting to see what would happen next. Judge Chen turned to Richard Palmer. Mr. Palmer, I'm dismissing this citation. The court recognizes that you were facing extraordinary circumstances, that you have an exemplary driving record, and that you cooperated fully with law enforcement. However, I want you to understand something important. If your wife had been in the car with you, the appropriate action would have been to call 911 for an ambulance. Driving at high speeds, even in an emergency, puts everyone at risk, including you and your wife. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you so much. I promise I'll never— I know you won't, Judge Chen said gently. Now go home and enjoy that beautiful baby boy. And please give your wife the court's congratulations. Richard thanked her again, gathered his documents, and practically floated out of the courtroom, stopping only to shake his public defender's hand. Judge Chen turned back to David. He braced himself for what was coming. This was the moment she could embarrass him in front of everyone. She could reference the hallway incident. She could make an example of him for his lack of discretion, for his rigid thinking, for his quick judgments. But she didn't. Officer Harrison, she said simply, you're dismissed. Thank you for your testimony, that was it. No lecture, no public humiliation, just a professional dismissal. David stood up from the witness chair, feeling strangely off balance. He'd expected more. Maybe he'd wanted more. Some kind of punishment that would match the guilt he was feeling. As he walked back to his seat, he caught Judge Chen's eye one more time. She gave him the slightest nod. Not friendly exactly, but not hostile either. It was the nod of someone who had made their point and was giving him space to absorb it. David sat down next to Tom, who whispered, that could have gone worse. But David wasn't so sure, because what Judge Chen had done was almost harder than public humiliation. She'd shown him grace he didn't deserve. She'd treated him with more respect than he'd shown her. She'd given him a living example of what real authority looked like, of what it meant to have power and use it wisely. And somehow that was the most humbling thing of all. David sat back down, his mind spinning. Tom gave him a supportive pat on the shoulder, but David barely felt it. He was too busy replaying everything that had just happened. Judge Chen could have destroyed him up there. She could have mentioned the hallway incident, could have questioned his judgment in front of everyone. Instead, she'd simply dismissed him and moved on. But the lesson had landed anyway. Maybe even harder because of how she'd delivered it. The court session continued. David had 2 more cases on the docket, but they were simple ones that wouldn't require his testimony. A defendant pleaded guilty to running a stop sign. Another accepted a plea deal for driving without insurance. Both cases were handled quickly, with David simply there as the citing officer on record. He watched Judge Chen work through case after case, and the more he watched, the more he understood what he'd been missing all these years. A young woman in her early 20s approached the bench next. She wore a fast food uniform with a name tag that said Ashley, and she looked absolutely terrified. Her hands shook as she held a crumpled piece of paper. Case number 3012, the bailiff announced. The state versus Ashley Rodriguez. Driving with an expired license. The young woman's public defender stood beside her, a patient-looking woman in her 40s who'd clearly been explaining how court worked right up until they were called. Ms. Rodriguez, Judge Chen said gently, noticing the woman's fear. This is your first time in court, isn't it? Ashley nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Your Honor. There's no need to be frightened. Just answer my questions honestly, and we'll work through this together. Can you tell me why your license expired? Ashley's eyes filled with tears, but she fought to keep her composure. I'm sorry, Your Honor, I know there's no excuse. I work 2 jobs and I'm taking care of my little brother since my mom got sick. She has cancer and she can't work anymore. I was choosing between renewing my license and buying groceries and She paused, wiping her eyes. I kept putting it off because I didn't have the $80 for the renewal fee. Judge Chen listened carefully, her expression sympathetic but not pitying. And I see from the police report that you were pulled over for a broken taillight. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. I didn't even know it was broken. The officer was very nice about it. He told me to get it fixed, but then he ran my license and saw it was expired. He said he had to give me a ticket. David felt a pang in his chest. That officer had been Tom. His partner had written this ticket just last week. Tom had mentioned feeling bad about it, saying the girl seemed like she was barely holding it together. Judge Chen reviewed the paperwork in front of her. I see you've since renewed your license. When did you do that? 3 days ago, Your Honor. I got my paycheck and went straight to the DMV. And I got my taillight fixed too. I have the receipt here if you want to see it. Ashley handed over a receipt with trembling hands. Judge Chen examined it and nodded. Ms. Rodriguez, the law is clear. You're required to maintain a valid driver's license if you're going to operate a vehicle. You understand that, correct? Yes, Your Honor, I'm so sorry. However, Judge Chen continued, her tone softening, the law also exists in the real world, where people face difficult choices. I can see that you're working hard and dealing with a very challenging family situation. You've already taken care of the license and the taillight, which shows responsibility. Ashley nodded, not sure where this was going. I'm going to reduce your fine to $50 and I'm giving you 6 months to pay it. You can make payments of $10 a month if that's easier for your budget. Does that sound manageable? The relief on Ashley's face was immediate. Yes, Your Honor, thank you so much. I can do that. Judge Chen wasn't finished. She wrote something on a piece of paper and handed it to the bailiff, who gave it to Ashley. This is information about local resources that might help your family. There's a program through the county that provides assistance for families dealing with serious illness. I can't promise they'll be able to help, but it's worth looking into. Ashley stared at the paper like it was made of gold. Tears streamed down her face freely now. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you so much, Your Honor. As Ashley left the courtroom, David felt something shift inside him. He'd seen hundreds of expired license cases in his career. Most of the time, they were just another ticket, another fine, another person who didn't follow the rules. He'd never thought much about the stories behind them, but Judge Chen had taken the time to ask. She'd seen Ashley not as a case number or a violation, but as a human being struggling to keep her family afloat. The next case involved an older man named Vincent who'd been caught driving 15 miles over the speed limit on the highway. He was in his 70s with white hair and kind eyes. He walked slowly to the bench with a cane. Mr. Vincent, Judge Chen said, I see you have quite a long driving record. 60 years with only 2 previous tickets, both decades ago. That's impressive, Vincent smiled. I've always been a careful driver, Your Honor. This ticket surprised me as much as anyone. The officer noted that you seemed confused during the traffic stop. Can you tell me what happened? Vincent's smile faded. I was coming back from my wife's memory care facility. She has Alzheimer's and I visit her every day. That particular day had been hard. She didn't recognize me and I was upset when I left. I honestly didn't realize how fast I was going. My mind was somewhere else. Judge Chen's expression grew more somber. I'm sorry to hear about your wife, Mr. Vincent. How long has she been in the facility? 2 years now, Vincent said quietly. Some days she knows me, some days she doesn't. You never know which version you're going to get. That must be incredibly difficult. It is, Your Honor. But I made a vow to her 52 years ago and I intend to keep it, for better or for worse in sickness and in health. The courtroom was quiet. Even the court reporter, who'd probably heard thousands of cases, looked touched. Judge Chen reviewed the file again. Mr. Vincent, given your excellent driving record and the circumstances, I'm reducing this to a warning. However, I need to ask you something important. Do you feel safe driving? I ask out of concern, not judgment. Vincent considered the question seriously. Most days, yes. That day I should have pulled over and collected myself before getting on the highway. I know that now. If you ever feel like you're not safe to drive, please don't hesitate to ask for help. There are senior transportation services available. Promise me you'll consider them if you need to. I promise, Your Honor, and thank you for understanding. As Vincent slowly made his way out of the courtroom, David found himself thinking about his own grandmother, who'd given up driving last year after 50 years behind the wheel. He remembered how hard that decision had been for her, how much independence she'd felt she was losing. He'd never connected that personal experience to his work. Traffic violations had always been black and white to him, but Judge Chen was showing him that every case was personal to someone. Every ticket had a human story attached to it. The morning wore on. A college student who'd run a red light while rushing to take his sick roommate to the emergency room. A single father who'd been caught without proof of insurance because he'd switched companies, and the new cards hadn't arrived yet. A woman who'd made an illegal U-turn because she'd gotten lost trying to find her daughter's new school. In each case, Judge Chen balanced accountability with compassion. She didn't let people off completely, but she took the time to understand their circumstances. She asked questions that no one else thought to ask. She saw patterns and connections that David had been missing his entire career. Tom leaned over during a brief pause. "She's something else, isn't she?" David nodded. "Yeah, she really is. You know what's crazy?" Tom continued. "She could have destroyed you up there after what happened in the hallway. But she didn't. She let her work speak for itself." "I know," David said quietly. "That takes a special kind of person. Someone who doesn't need to prove anything to anyone because they already know who they are." David watched Judge Chen review the next case file, her reading glasses perched on her nose, that coffee stain still visible on her sleeve beneath the robe. She looked tired now. It was almost noon, and she'd been handling cases non-stop since 9:15. But she gave each person the same careful attention, the same dignity, the same chance to be heard. And David realized something profound. All his life, he'd equated authority with appearance. The pressed uniform, the polished badge, the commanding presence. He'd thought those things made him a good officer, that they automatically earned him respect. But Judge Chen had shown him something different. Real authority didn't come from how you looked or how loudly you spoke. It came from how you treated people, especially when you had power over them. It came from wisdom, from compassion, from the willingness to see beyond the surface of things. The bailiff called a lunch recess, and the courtroom began to empty. David stood up, feeling like a different person than he'd been when he walked in that morning. He knew what he had to do next. It wouldn't be easy and it wouldn't erase what had happened, but it was necessary. He needed to apologize. Most people filed out of the courtroom for the lunch break, eager to grab food or stretch their legs. Defense attorneys gathered their papers and headed for the cafeteria. The prosecutor left to make phone calls. Within minutes, the courtroom was nearly empty. David remained in his seat, his heart pounding. Tom looked at him questioningly. "You coming to lunch?" Tom asked. "I need to do something first," David said. "You go ahead." Tom studied his friend's face and seemed to understand. He nodded and left without another word, leaving David alone in the courtroom except for the bailiff, Robert, who was organizing paperwork at his desk. Judge Chen emerged from her chambers a few minutes later, no longer wearing her robe. She was back in just her wrinkled blue blazer, carrying that worn leather briefcase. She looked tired, and David noticed she was rubbing her temples like she had a headache. She noticed David sitting there and paused, her expression neutral but curious. David stood up quickly, his hat in his hands. His mouth felt dry again, but this time it wasn't from fear of testifying. It was from the weight of what he needed to say. "Your Honor," he began, his voice rougher than he intended. "May I have a moment of your time?" Judge Chen glanced at her watch, then at her briefcase, probably thinking about the lunch she'd planned to grab. But she nodded and set the briefcase down on the defense table. "Of course, Officer Harrison." David walked toward her, stopping at a respectful distance. For a moment, he didn't know how to start. He'd rehearsed this in his head during the last few cases, but now that he was standing here, all those practiced words seemed inadequate. "I need to apologize," he finally said, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "For what I said in the hallway this morning. For how I treated you. There's no excuse for it, and I'm deeply sorry." Judge Chen was quiet for a moment, studying him. Her expression didn't give much away. She simply listened. "I made assumptions about you based on your appearance," David continued, the words coming faster now. "I was dismissive and disrespectful. I said things that were completely out of line. And the worst part is, you heard everything and you still showed me more professionalism and grace than I showed you." He paused, struggling with the emotion that was rising in his throat. I've been a police officer for 16 years. I thought I was good at my job. I thought I understood what it meant to serve and protect. But watching you in that courtroom today, I realized how much I've been getting wrong. Judge Chen's expression softened slightly, but she remained quiet, giving him space to continue. Every person who came before you today, you saw them, David said. Really saw them, not just as violations or case numbers, but as human beings with stories and struggles. Ashley trying to take care of her sick mother, Vincent dealing with his wife's Alzheimer's, Richard panicking about his wife in labor. You took the time to understand their circumstances. You balanced the law with compassion. He looked down at his hat, turning it in his hands. I've written hundreds of tickets over the years. Thousands, probably. And I always thought I was being fair, being professional. But I was just going through the motions, applying rules without really thinking about the people behind them, without using the kind of wisdom you showed today. David looked back up at her. The way I treated you in that hallway, that wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was a reflection of how I've been approaching this job, making snap judgments, seeing surfaces instead of substance, thinking that authority means being rigid and unyielding. Judge Chen finally spoke, her voice gentle but firm. Officer Harrison, I appreciate your apology. Truly I do, and I accept it. David felt a small wave of relief, but he knew she wasn't finished. I've been doing this work for 8 years now, she continued. But I've been underestimated much longer than that. When I was a young public defender right out of law school, people assumed I was a paralegal or a court intern. When I made partner at my firm, clients would sometimes ask to speak to a male attorney instead. When I was appointed to the bench, I had colleagues who questioned whether I was ready. She smiled slightly, but there was a hint of sadness in it. I've been judged by my appearance, my age, my gender. I've walked into rooms where people dismissed me before I ever opened my mouth. So yes, what happened in the hallway this morning was hurtful, but it wasn't unfamiliar. David felt shame wash over him again, but Judge Chen held up a hand. However, I've learned something important through all of that, she said. Dignity isn't something that others can give you or take away. It's something you carry within yourself. It's how you treat people, especially when you have power over them. It's how you handle yourself when others misjudge you. She picked up her briefcase and held it, the worn leather catching the light. This briefcase belonged to my father. He was a construction worker who saved for years to send me to college. He never went to law school, never wore a suit to work, never sat in a courtroom except once when he got a speeding ticket. But he was one of the most dignified men I've ever known. Not because of what he wore or what his job was, but because of how he treated every single person he met with respect. Judge Chen's eyes grew distant for a moment, lost in memory. He taught me that real authority doesn't come from a title or a position. It comes from character, from integrity, from the willingness to do what's right even when it's difficult. She looked directly at David now, and her gaze was penetrating but not unkind. You wear a badge, Officer Harrison. That badge gives you tremendous power in people's lives. You can change someone's day, their week, their circumstances with a single decision. The question isn't whether you'll make mistakes or have bad days, we all do. The question is whether you'll remain open to learning, to growing, to seeing your own blind spots. David nodded, absorbing every word. Today you showed me something important, Judge Chen said. You showed me that you're capable of reflection and humility. You could have just gone to lunch, chalked this morning up to an embarrassing moment and moved on. But instead you stayed. You faced your mistake head on. That takes courage. And it tells me that you're the kind of officer who can grow from this. She adjusted the strap of her briefcase on her shoulder. I'm not angry with you, Officer Harrison. I'm disappointed in the moment, yes, but I'm hopeful about what comes next. Because I believe you're going to take what you saw in that courtroom today and let it change how you approach your work. Am I right about that? Yes, Your Honor, David said, his voice thick with emotion. Absolutely. I promise you I'm going to do better. Then that's all I can ask for, Judge Chen said. She extended her hand and David shook it, feeling the firmness of her grip. Thank you, he said, for your grace, for the lesson, for treating me better than I treated you. We all deserve second chances, Officer Harrison. Every single person who walked through that courtroom today, including you. The key is what we do with those chances. She started to walk past him, then paused and turned back. One more thing. That young woman, Ashley Rodriguez, with the expired license, she reminded me of my mother when I was young. Working multiple jobs, choosing between bills and necessities, trying to hold everything together. The officer who stopped her, your partner Tom, he could have impounded her car, made her situation even worse. But he showed discretion. He wrote the ticket because he had to, but he didn't pile on extra charges. That's the kind of officer who understands that enforcing the law and destroying someone's life are two different things. David thought about Tom, about all the times his partner had urged him to be a little more flexible, a little more understanding. Tom had been trying to teach him the same lesson Judge Chen had demonstrated today. But David hadn't been ready to hear it. "I'll remember that," David said. Judge Chen nodded and walked toward the door, then stopped one more time. "Oh, and Officer Harrison? Next time you see someone in the courthouse who doesn't look like they belong, maybe consider that they might belong more than anyone else there. Some of the best judges, lawyers, and officers I know don't fit the typical mold. That's what makes them great at their jobs. They understand the people they serve because they've walked in their shoes." With that, she left the courtroom, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. David stood there for a long moment, letting everything sink in. Robert, the bailiff, had been quietly observing the entire exchange. He walked over to David and put a hand on his shoulder. "She's one of the good ones," Robert said. "We're lucky to have her." "Yeah," David agreed. "We really are." David left the courthouse a different man than he'd been when he arrived that morning. He'd come in thinking he had everything figured out, that his 16 years of experience had taught him all he needed to know. He was leaving with the understanding that he still had so much to learn. As he walked to his patrol car, he thought about all the people he'd interact with in his remaining years on the force. The drivers he'd pull over, the witnesses he'd interview, the citizens he'd encounter every single day. Each one of them had a story, a struggle, a humanity that deserved to be seen and respected. He thought about the young officers he'd trained, the advice he'd given them about being tough and following the rules. He'd need to have different conversations with them now. Conversations about wisdom and compassion, about seeing people rather than just violations. David got into his car and sat there for a moment, looking back at the courthouse. Somewhere in there, Judge Chen was probably eating lunch, preparing for the afternoon session, continuing to serve justice with dignity and grace. And he was going to spend the rest of his career trying to do the same. Because that's what real authority looked like. That's what real service meant. And finally, after 16 years, he understood the difference.